The streets were alive with the usual morning bustle. Vendors shouted out their prices, rickshaws weaved through the crowd, and the scent of fresh produce filled the air. Among the many sellers lining the busy marketplace was Ravi, a humble vegetable seller. His stall, though small, was neatly arranged with bright red tomatoes, fresh green chilies, and leafy spinach stacked in perfect order. Unlike the other sellers, who focused solely on making a profit, Ravi had a warmth that made people return to his stall again and again. Ravi had been selling vegetables in this market for years. He wasn't rich, nor did he own a fancy shop, but what he did have was an unshakable spirit and a heart full of kindness. Every morning, he would wake up before sunrise, head to the wholesale market, and carefully pick the freshest vegetables for his customers. He believed that quality and honesty were more valuable than quick money. His regular customers trusted him, and new ones were always drawn in by his genuine smile. One such customer was Anjali, a young woman who had recently moved to the city. She was a school teacher, and every evening, after a long day of work, she would stop by Ravi's stall to buy vegetables. Over time, she noticed something different about Ravi. He wasn't just another vendor trying to sell his goods. He always had a kind word for everyone, especially the elderly and children. If someone didn't have enough money, he would still give them what they needed, telling them to pay later, even if he knew they might never return. One rainy evening, as the marketplace was beginning to close, Anjali saw something that left her stunned. A wealthy man, dressed in expensive clothes, stopped at Ravi's stall. He looked out of place among the regular customers. Without hesitation, Ravi handed him a small bag of vegetables. There was no money exchanged, just a brief nod of understanding between the two men. The rich man whispered a quiet "thank you" before disappearing into the narrow streets. Anjali couldn't help but wonder, who was that man? And why did Ravi, a simple vegetable seller, offer him food without taking any payment? It wasn't just about generosity. There was something more, something hidden behind Ravi's usual smile. That night, Anjali lay awake, thinking about the strange interaction she had witnessed. What secret was Ravi hiding? Little did she know, the answer to that question would change everything. The next day, Anjali couldn't shake off the thought of what she had seen. As she walked to the market after school, she kept replaying the moment in her mind. The way Ravi had handed over the vegetables so effortlessly, the silent understanding between him and the rich man. She had always known Ravi as a kind and generous man, but this felt different. It was almost as if there was a hidden connection between them, something unspoken yet powerful. When she reached Ravi's stall, he was busy arranging fresh produce like every other day. His hands moved swiftly, placing ripe tomatoes in neat rows and bundling coriander leaves with thin strips of jute. Despite the simplicity of his work, there was something admirable about the way he did it, with care, precision, and a quiet dignity. Anjali hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. "Bia, can I ask you something?" she said, her voice softer than usual. Ravi looked up and smiled. "Of course, madam. What do you need today?" "It's not about the vegetables," she said, choosing her words carefully. "Yesterday, I saw you giving food to that man in the suit. Who was he?" For a brief second, something flickered in Ravi's eyes, but it disappeared just as quickly. He continued arranging the vegetables as if nothing had happened. "Oh, him," he said lightly. "Just someone who needed some help. Nothing unusual." His casual response only made Anjali more curious. It was clear that Ravi didn't want to talk about it. But why? What was he hiding? She decided not to press further. Instead, she picked up a handful of green chilies and placed them in her basket. "Okay, Bia," she said, acting as if she had let the matter go. "Give me half a kilo of tomatoes too." Ravi nodded and started weighing the vegetables. The normalcy of their exchange should have reassured her, but it didn't. She could feel that something was off, something just beneath the surface. As she walked back home, she kept thinking about Ravi's life. He was always here, from morning till late evening, selling vegetables and chatting with customers. But did anyone truly know who he was beyond this small stall? Did he have a family? Where did he go after the market closed? The more she thought about it, the stranger it seemed. She had never seen Ravi talk about his own life. People came and went, sharing their worries, their joys, but Ravi never spoke much about himself. That night, as Anjali sat by her window, she made a decision. She would find out the truth. There was something about Ravi that didn't add up, and she needed to understand what it was. The next evening, she returned to the market earlier than usual. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the busy street. She walked past fruit vendors, spice sellers, and tea stalls until she reached Ravi's corner. He was still attending to customers, but the crowd was thinning. Anjali stood at a distance, pretending to browse another stall. She wanted to see where Ravi went after he closed his shop. She had no idea why she was so determined, but something inside her told her that this was important. After some time, Ravi started packing up. He carefully covered the leftover vegetables with a cloth and secured the wooden crates. Then, instead of heading home like the other vendors, he picked up a small bag and walked away, disappearing into the narrow alley behind the market. Anjali hesitated for only a moment before following him. The alley was dimly lit, and the noise of the market faded as she walked deeper into the maze of small streets. She kept a safe distance, making sure not to be noticed. Ravi moved quickly, as if he knew exactly where he was going. He turned a corner, then another, finally stopping in front of a small, run-down house. The walls were cracked, and the paint was peeling. A single dim bulb flickered above the door. Anjali hid behind a nearby wall and watched as Ravi knocked softly. A few seconds later, the door creaked open, and an old woman appeared. She looked frail, her eyes filled with sadness. Ravi handed her the bag of vegetables and spoke in a low voice. Though Anjali couldn't hear their conversation, she could see the way the woman's face changed, from worry to relief, and then to gratitude. Ravi placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder before turning away and walking back towards the main street. The old woman stood in the doorway for a moment, holding the bag tightly, before disappearing inside. Anjali felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just an act of kindness. There was something deeper, something she still didn't understand. Who was the old woman? And why was Ravi helping her in secret? As she made her way back home, 100 questions filled her mind. She had uncovered a piece of the mystery, but there was still so much she didn't know. One thing was certain: Ravi was not just a simple vegetable seller. There was a story hidden behind his quiet smile, a story waiting to be told. The next day, Anjali found herself distracted at work. Even as she stood in front of her students, writing math equations on the blackboard, her mind kept wandering back to what she had seen. The frail old woman, Ravi's quiet yet purposeful actions, the secrecy, none of it made sense. Was Ravi helping this woman out of kindness, or was there something deeper at play? After school, she didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the market, but this time, instead of heading directly to Ravi's stall, she observed from a distance. He was busy as usual, chatting with customers, smiling, arranging vegetables with the same patience he always had. It was almost impossible to believe that the same man had been sneaking through alleys the night before, delivering food in silence. She decided to try again. This time, she approached the stall casually, as if nothing was different. "Bia, I need some fresh spinach today," she said, keeping her voice light. Ravi smiled and picked out a bunch. "Very fresh, madam. You'll like this." Anjali hesitated, then added, "By the way, I saw you near the old quarters yesterday evening. You were helping someone." For a moment, Ravi's hand paused over the weighing scale. But his face didn't change. He simply nodded. "Yes, I was. She's an old lady who needs food sometimes. Nothing special." Anjali could tell he was being careful with his words. "You didn't tell me you do charity work," she said, watching him closely. Ravi smiled, but this time, it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Madam, kindness doesn't need an announcement. She wanted to push further, ask more, but she knew she wouldn't get answers this way. So she simply nodded, took her vegetables, and walked away. But she wasn't done. Later that night, curiosity got the best of her. She found herself walking through the same alley again, her steps cautious. This time, she wanted to see the old woman up close, to understand who she was. The street was quieter than before. The dim bulb above the door flickered again, casting long shadows against the cracked walls. Anjali stood near the entrance, unsure of what to do next. Should she knock? Should she wait? Just as she was about to turn away, the door creaked open. The old woman stood there, wrapped in a thin shawl, her eyes filled with the weight of years. She studied Anjali for a long moment before speaking. "You're not from around here," she said, her voice raspy. Anjali hesitated. I buy vegetables from Ravi Bhaiya," she said, hoping the name would earn her some trust. At the mention of his name, the woman's expression softened. She looked around as if making sure no one else was listening, then gestured for Anjali to step inside. The room was small and dimly lit. A single cot stood against the wall, a wooden shelf with a few metal pots in the corner. The air smelled of old books and spices, a strange yet comforting mix. The old woman sat on a rickety wooden stool, watching Anjali carefully. "You shouldn't be here, child," she said after a long pause. Anjali frowned. "Why?" The woman sighed, running her fingers over the edges of her shawl. "Because you're asking questions about a man who does not want to be known." Anjali's heart pounded. "Why does Ravi Bhaiya help you?" The woman let out a slow breath, as if debating whether to answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Because once upon a time, I helped him." Anjali leaned forward, hanging on to every word. "What do you mean?" The old woman hesitated, her gaze distant. "It was many years ago," she murmured, "before he was a vegetable seller. Before everything changed." Anjali felt a chill run down her spine. Ravi had a past she knew nothing about, and whatever it was still shaping his life today. But before she could ask anything more, the old woman straightened, her expression suddenly guarded. "Enough questions," she said firmly. "Go home, child, and forget about all this." Anjali wanted to protest, but there was something final in the woman's tone. She stood up slowly, realizing she wouldn't get any more answers tonight. As she stepped out into the dark alley, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't forget about this. She wouldn't. Because Ravi's past was a puzzle, and she had just found the first missing piece. Anjali couldn't sleep that night. The old woman's words echoed in her mind. Before he was a vegetable seller. Before everything changed. There was more to Ravi than she had ever imagined. He wasn't just a kind man helping those in need. He was someone with a past, someone with a story that had been carefully hidden. The next morning, she went about her routine, but her thoughts remained restless. She knew she shouldn't get involved, but curiosity pulled her in deeper. She wanted to understand who Ravi really was. And she had a feeling the old woman held the key to everything. By the time evening arrived, she found herself standing outside the small house again. This time, she didn't hesitate. She knocked. The door opened slowly, and the old woman's weary eyes met hers. "I told you to forget about this," she said quietly. Anjali took a deep breath. "I can't." The woman studied her for a long moment, then sighed and stepped aside, allowing her in. The small room looked the same as before, bare, quiet, untouched by time. The old woman settled onto her stool, wrapping her shawl tightly around her frail shoulders. "If you're here," she said slowly, "you must promise me something." Anjali nodded. "What?" "Whatever I tell you, whatever you learn, you cannot look at Ravi the same way again." A strange fear settled in Anjali's chest, but she nodded anyway. The woman stared at the floor for a long time before she finally spoke. "Years ago, Ravi wasn't selling vegetables on the street. He was someone else. Someone important. Anjali held her breath. He was a businessman, the woman continued, her voice distant, as if reliving a memory. Not in the way you'd expect. He wasn't rich, but he was skilled. He knew how to talk, how to make deals. He worked for someone powerful. And for a while, everything was fine. Anjali's heartbeat quickened. This was not what she had expected. But power is dangerous, the old woman murmured. And one day, Ravi found himself in the middle of something he never should have been a part of. Anjali felt a shiver run down her spine. What happened? The woman hesitated. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, he made a mistake. A mistake that cost him everything. Anjali leaned in closer. What kind of mistake? The old woman glanced at the door, as if afraid someone might be listening. He trusted the wrong person. The words hung heavy in the air. He lost everything overnight, she continued. His job, his home, his name. Anjali felt her stomach twist. Ravi, the man who stood in the market every day, smiling, selling vegetables, had once been someone entirely different. But if he had lost everything, why had he never spoken about it? The old woman's gaze darkened. He had to disappear. Anjali's breath caught. Disappear? The woman nodded. That's why he's here. That's why he keeps his head down, why he helps in silence. Anjali struggled to process what she had just heard. But why? Why is he still hiding? The woman exhaled slowly. Because the past never forgets. Anjali's chest tightened. Somewhere in the distance, a market bell rang, signaling closing time. The old woman looked at her with tired eyes. You wanted the truth, child. Now you have it. Anjali sat there, her mind racing. Ravi wasn't just a kind vegetable seller. He was a man running from something. From someone. And now, she had to decide what to do with the truth. Anjali sat frozen, the weight of the old woman's words pressing down on her. Ravi wasn't just a simple vegetable seller. He was someone who had vanished from another life, someone who had been forced to erase his past. But why? And more importantly, was he still in danger? Her mind raced with questions, but she knew she wouldn't get any more answers from the old woman tonight. She stood up slowly. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. The woman only nodded, her eyes distant, as if she were lost in memories of a time long gone. As Anjali stepped out into the dark alley, the night air felt colder than before. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and made her way back home, her thoughts swirling in a storm of uncertainty. She needed to talk to Ravi. The next morning, Anjali reached the market earlier than usual. The stalls were just opening, and the streets were quieter. Ravi was arranging his vegetables like always, his hands moving with practiced ease. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. Madam, early today. What will you have? He asked cheerfully. Anjali hesitated for a moment, then stepped closer. Bia, can we talk? Ravi's smile faltered slightly, but he nodded. He wiped his hands on his cloth and gestured to the side. What's on your mind? She took a deep breath. I know, she said quietly. For the first time, Ravi's face changed. His usual calm expression flickered with something else, something close to fear. I know you weren't always a vegetable seller, she continued, watching his reaction closely. I know you had a different life before this. Ravi didn't speak for a long time. Then, in a low voice, he asked, Who told you? Anjali swallowed. The old woman. Ravi exhaled sharply and looked away. His fingers curled into a fist, but he quickly relaxed them. I shouldn't have involved her, he murmured. Who are you hiding from? Anjali pressed. Ravi shook his head. You shouldn't have asked. His voice was firm, but Anjali could hear the weariness in it. He had been carrying this secret for too long. I had to, she said. Because last night, after I left, Someone was watching me. Ravi's head snapped up. What? Anjali's heart pounded. She hadn't wanted to believe it at first. But when she had walked home, she had felt it, that unmistakable feeling of being followed. The sound of footsteps too close, a shadow moving when she turned a corner. When she had looked back, there had been no one. But she knew what she had felt. I don't know who it was, she said. But someone knows I've been asking about you. Ravi's expression darkened. He turned back to his stall and began packing his vegetables hurriedly. What are you doing? Anjali asked. I need to leave, Ravi said, his voice clipped. Leave? But I should have left a long time ago, he muttered. I stayed because I thought it was safe. But if they're watching, then it's not safe anymore. Anjali's stomach twisted. Who are they? Ravi didn't answer. Instead, he looked at her with an urgency she had never seen before. Listen to me, madam. You need to forget about all of this. Go home. Live your life. Pretend you never knew me. Anjali's breath caught. No. Please, he said. You don't understand how dangerous this is. But Anjali shook her head. I don't care how dangerous it is. If you're in trouble, I want to help. Ravi stared at her for a long moment. Then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair. You're stubborn, he muttered. Anjali crossed her arms. Yes. Now tell me the truth. Ravi looked around cautiously. The market was filling up, people passing by, buying vegetables, bargaining over prices. To everyone else, this was just another normal day. But for Ravi, it wasn't normal anymore. After a long pause, he spoke. There's someone I hoped I'd never see again, he said quietly. Someone who doesn't forget. Anjali felt a shiver run down her spine. They must have found me, he continued. And now that you've been asking questions, they know about you too. Anjali's mouth went dry. You should have never gotten involved, Ravi said. Because now, it's too late to turn back. Anjali's heart pounded as she processed Ravi's words. Someone dangerous was after him. And now, because of her questions, she was caught in the middle of it. But she couldn't walk away, not when Ravi's fear was so real. She took a deep breath. We need to do something. Ravi shook his head. No. I need to disappear. You need to stay away. But before Anjali could argue, something caught her eye. Across the market, near the tea stall, a man stood watching them. He was dressed simply, blending in with the crowd, but his eyes were locked onto Ravi. The moment Ravi turned, the man shifted slightly, as if confirming something to himself. Ravi stiffened. His face lost all color. He's here, Ravi whispered. Anjali's stomach dropped. Who is he? Ravi didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed Anjali's wrist and pulled her through the narrow back alley behind the stalls. His grip was firm, his pace urgent. We need to go, he said under his breath. Now. Anjali followed, barely keeping up as they weaved through the maze of alleyways. Her mind raced with questions, but she knew there was no time for answers now. Finally, Ravi stopped in a quiet courtyard, breathing heavily. He glanced around, making sure they weren't followed. Then he turned to her, his expression grim. I was never meant to survive, he said. Anjali's breath caught. What? Ravi exhaled slowly. Years ago, I worked for a powerful man. I trusted him. I did everything he asked. But one day, I discovered something I wasn't supposed to. Anjali's pulse quickened. I tried to walk away, Ravi continued. But people like him. They don't let you leave. Anjali felt a chill run down her spine. I disappeared, Ravi said. Changed everything. My name, my life. I thought I was safe. He shook his head. But now they've found me. Anjali swallowed hard. And that man back there? He's a messenger, Ravi said. They never come alone. Before Anjali could respond, footsteps echoed in the alley behind them. She turned sharply. Two men. Approaching fast. Ravi grabbed her hand. Run! They sprinted through the narrow streets, past old buildings and abandoned doorways. Anjali's heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the footsteps gaining on them. Ravi suddenly pulled her into a small doorway, pressing them both against the wall. He held a finger to his lips, signaling her to stay quiet. The men ran past, their heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Ravi exhaled. We don't have much time. Anjali turned to him. What do we do now? He hesitated, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a folded piece of paper and pressed it into her hand. If anything happens to me, he said, find the old woman. Give this to her. Anjali's fingers trembled as she took the paper. No. We'll get out of this together. But before Ravi could reply, a voice echoed through the alley. You can't run forever, Ravi. They turned. The man from the market stood at the entrance, flanked by two others. His face was calm, almost amused. Do you really think you could hide forever? The man said, stepping forward. You owe a debt, and debts must be paid. Anjali's breath hitched. Ravi clenched his fists. I don't owe you anything. The man chuckled. Oh, but you do. He tilted his head. Did you really think we forgot? Ravi said nothing. The man's gaze shifted to Anjali. And now, you've dragged an innocent person into this. He sighed. Unfortunate. Anjali's pulse raced. I won't let you hurt her, Ravi said firmly. The man smirked. Oh, I'm not here for her. He stepped closer. I'm here for you. Anjali's fingers tightened around the paper in her hand. She didn't know what was written inside, but she knew one thing. It was Ravi's last secret, and it might be the only thing that could save him. Anjali's heart pounded as the man stepped closer, his cold eyes fixed on Ravi. The alley felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the walls were closing in. Ravi stood his ground, his body tense, but Anjali could see it, the fear in his eyes. He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for her. She clenched the paper in her hand. If Ravi had given it to her, it had to mean something. A clue. A way out. She knew she had only seconds to decide. Slowly, she took a step forward. If you're here for him, she said, her voice steady, then you should know he's not the same man you're looking for. The man's gaze flickered toward her, amused. And what do you know about it? Anjali took a deep breath. I know that whatever happened in the past, Ravi left it behind. He's not your problem anymore. The man laughed, shaking his head. You think it's that simple? He turned to Ravi. Tell her. Tell her what you did. Ravi didn't move. The man's smirk faded. You betrayed the wrong people, Ravi. You should have disappeared for good. Anjali saw Ravi's hands tighten into fists. His whole body was rigid, as if he was fighting an internal war. Then, finally, he spoke. I never betrayed anyone, he said, his voice quiet but firm. I walked away because I saw the truth. And you know it. The man's jaw twitched. You work for a man who destroys lives, Ravi continued. I refuse to be a part of it. That's why you're here. Not because of what I did, but because of what I didn't do. The man took another step forward. You think that makes you innocent? Ravi shook his head. No. But it makes me free. For a long moment, there was silence. Anjali's grip on the paper tightened. Then, slowly, she unfolded it. Her eyes widened as she scanned the words. It wasn't just a note. It was proof of something bigger. Something dangerous. Her heart raced as she realized what it meant. This, she said, holding up the paper, is the reason you're really here, isn't it? The man's expression darkened. He didn't need to see what was written. He already knew. Anjali's mind worked quickly. If this paper was important enough to scare them, then it was also important enough to protect Ravi. You can't touch him, she said, her voice firm. Not if this exists. The man's eyes locked onto hers, calculating. For a moment, the tension thickened. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Clever. He glanced at Ravi one last time, then took a slow step back. Enjoy your freedom while it lasts. And with that, he turned and walked away, his men following closely behind. Anjali let out a shaky breath, barely believing what had just happened. She turned to Ravi. What was that? Ravi exhaled, running a hand through his hair. A gamble, he admitted. One that almost didn't work. Anjali looked down at the paper. What is this? Ravi hesitated. The truth, he finally said. The truth about the man I used to work for. The things he's done. I kept it in case I ever needed it. Anjali swallowed. And now? Ravi sighed. Now, I need to make sure he never comes after me again. She nodded, understanding. You're leaving, aren't you? Ravi gave her a small, sad smile. I have to. Anjali felt a lump rise in her throat. She had only known Ravi for a short time, but he had become a part of her life. The thought of him disappearing forever felt unfair. But you'll be okay, she asked softly. Ravi nodded. I will. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Ravi reached out and placed a small bag of vegetables in her hands. One last gift, he said with a grin. Anjali laughed, though it was bittersweet. And then, just like that, Ravi turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Anjali watched him go, knowing she would probably never see him again. But as she stood there, holding the piece of paper that had saved his life, she realized something. Some stories don't have perfect endings. Some stories leave behind unanswered questions. But Ravi's story, his unbelievable story, was one she would never forget. And in a way that was enough.